We're also examining a number of changes that Florida has made to its electoral process, including changes to the procedures governing third-party voter registration organizations, as well as changes to early voting procedures, including the number of days in the early voting period. Now, although I cannot go into detail about the ongoing review of these and other state law changes, I can assure you that it will be thorough and it will be fair. We will examine the facts and we will apply the law. If a state passes a new voting law and it meets its burden of showing that the law is not discriminatory, we will follow the law and we will approve the change. And where a state cannot meet this burden, we will object as part of our obligation under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, as many of you know, and as I hope the law students here are learning, Section 5 was put in place decades ago because of a well-documented history of voter discrimination in all or parts of the 16 states to which it applies. Within these so-called covered jurisdictions, any proposed change in voting procedures or practices, from moving a polling location to enacting a statewide redistricting plan, must be pre-cleared, that is approved, either by the Justice Department or by a panel of federal judges. Now, without question, Section 5's pre-clearance process has been a powerful tool in combating discrimination for decades. In 2006, it was reauthorized with overwhelming bipartisan support, passing the House by a vote of 390 to 33 and the Senate by a vote of 98 to 0 before being signed into law by President Bush. Despite the long history of support for Section 5, this keystone of our voting rights laws is now being challenged 5 years after its reauthorization as unconstitutional in no fewer than 5 lawsuits. Each of these lawsuits claims that we have attained a new era of electoral equality, that America in 2011 has moved beyond the challenges of 1965, and that Section 5 is no longer necessary. I wish this were the case. The reality is that in jurisdictions across the country, both overt and subtle forms of discrimination remain all too common, and we don't have to look far to see recent proof. For example, in October, the Justice Department objected to a redistricting plan in East Feliciana Parish, Louisiana, where the map drawer began the process by meeting exclusively with white office holders and never consulted black office holders. The result was a map that diminished the electoral opportunity of African Americans. After the Justice Department objected, the parish enacted a new non-discriminatory map. And here in Texas, just 2 months ago, the department argued in court filings that proposed redistricting plans for both the State House and the Texas congressional delegation are impermissible because the state has failed to show the absence of discrimination. The most recent census data indicated that Texas has gained more than 4 million new residents, the vast majority of whom are Hispanic, and that this growth allows for 4 new congressional seats. However, the state has proposed adding 0 additional seats in which Hispanics would have the electoral opportunity envisioned by the Voting Rights Act. Federal courts are still considering this matter, and we intend to argue vigorously at trial that this is precisely the kind of discrimination that Section 5 was intended to block. To those who argue that Section 5 is no longer necessary, these and other examples are proof that we still need this critical tool to combat discrimination and to safeguard the right to vote. As concerns about the protections of this right and the integrity of our election systems become an increasingly prominent part of our national dialogue, I think we must consider some important questions. It is time to ask, what kind of nation and what kind of people do we want to be? Are we willing to allow this era, our era, to be remembered as the age when our nation's proud tradition of expanding the franchise ended? Are we willing to allow this time, our time, to be recorded in history as the age when the long-held belief that in this country every citizen has the chance and the right to help shape their government became a relic of our past instead of a guidepost for our future? Well, for me and for our nation's Department of Justice, the answers are clear. We need election systems that are free from fraud, discrimination, and partisan influence, and that are more, not less, accessible to the citizens of this country. Under this administration, our Civil Rights Division and its voting section have taken meaningful steps to ensure integrity, independence, and transparency in our enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. We have worked successfully and comprehensively to protect the voting rights of U.S. service members and veterans, and to enforce other laws that protect Americans living abroad, citizens with disabilities, and language minorities. As part of our aggressive enforcement of the motor voter law, this year alone, we filed 2 statewide lawsuits to enforce the requirement that voter registration opportunities be made available at a wider variety of government offices beyond just the local Department of Motor Vehicles. And we're seeing promising results from this work. For example, after filing a lawsuit in Rhode Island, we reached an agreement with state agencies that resulted in more voters being registered in the first full month after our lawsuit than in the entire previous 2-year reporting period. We're also working to ensure that the protections for language minorities, including in the Voting Rights Act, are aggressively enforced. These protections now apply to more than 19 million voting-age citizens. These are our Spanish-speaking friends and neighbors, our Chinese-speaking friends and neighbors, and a large and growing part of all our communities. In just the past year, we filed 3 lawsuits to protect their rights. And today, we're actively reviewing nationwide compliance. But the Justice Department can't do it all. Ensuring that every veteran, every senior, every college student, every eligible citizen has the right to vote must become our common cause. And for all Americans, protecting this right, ensuring meaningful access, and combating discrimination must be viewed not only as a legal issue, but as a moral imperative. Just as we recently saw in Maine, where voters last month overturned a legislative proposal to end same-day voter registration, the ability to shape our laws remains in the hands of the American people. Tonight, I'd like to highlight 3 areas where public support will be crucial in driving progress and in advancing much-needed reforms. The first involves deceptive election practices and dishonest efforts to prevent certain voters from casting their ballots. Now, over the years, we've seen all sorts of attempts to gain partisan advantage by keeping people away from the polls, from literacy tests and poll taxes to misinformation campaigns telling people that Election Day has been moved or that only 1 adult per household can cast a ballot. Before the 2004 elections, flyers were distributed in minority neighborhoods in Milwaukee, falsely claiming that, and I quote again, "If anybody in your family has ever been found guilty of a crime, you can't vote in the presidential election," unquote. And you risk a 10-year prison sentence if you do. 2 years later, 14,000 Latino voters in Orange County, California received mailings warning in Spanish that, quote, "If you are an immigrant, voting in a federal election is a crime that can result in jail time," unquote. Both of these blatant falsehoods likely deterred some eligible citizens from going to the polls. And just last week, the campaign manager of a Maryland gubernatorial candidate was convicted on election fraud charges for approving anonymous robocalls that went out on Election Day last year to more than 100,000 voters in the state's 2 largest majority black jurisdictions. These calls encouraged voters to stay home, telling them to, quote, "relax," because their preferred candidate had already wrapped up a victory.